number increasing quickly. Excellent. I think we're at the official start time of the event. I see a few more participants joining, but we have a healthy number already, up at about 68. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, as these sessions will go quickly, and I think we have an important discussion to cover. So welcome to this session hosted by the START Network for Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week on tiered due diligence, if I can say that correctly. My name is Jeremy Rempel. I'm currently working as head of humanitarian finance for the ICFA network based in Geneva, and I'll be your moderator for the call today, for our session today, I should say. I think we have quite an interesting session ahead of us on tiered due diligence, both with an interesting topic, and I think with an excellent panel to give us some inputs on this topic as well, representing a range of actors in the humanitarian space, from START Network itself as a global network and representing a pooled fund, IDEA representing a local voice from Pakistan, and of course CHS Alliance representing the perspective of a global standards organization. And I will introduce our panelists in more detail in a moment. A couple of housekeeping items just to get us kicked off. I think time is short, so we will ask you to share your comments and questions in the chat for our Q&A later. So as we're going through our panel discussions, please feel free to post comments, questions that you have in the chat, so we'll be able to work through those quickly once we get to our Q&A session. And for those points that we're not able to follow up on, or answer questions we're not able to answer directly in the session today, we'll take note of those, and as appropriate, we'll work to follow up afterwards the session to those questions. So again, even if we're not able to get to all questions and comments in the chat, those are useful to have in there and provide a basis for us to follow up afterwards. Right. With that, I think we'll get into our session. And I wanted to, before we go over to our panel, both as a moderator and someone with actually an interest personally in this topic, personally and professionally in this topic of due diligence, wanted to take a couple of moments to share some background points to help frame the discussion that we'll have today. I just wanted to highlight that this broader work on due diligence, certainly as part of the broader theme on simplification and harmonization of humanitarian partnerships, is not new. This work in this area, I should say, has been going on for some time. Certainly, the interest in how we improve efficiency, effectiveness, and funding, reduce some of the burdens on staff, particularly staff down to the local level when it comes to partnerships, has been an interest of a number of us in the humanitarian space for several years. Just highlight a few examples of work that's been ongoing for some time. Certainly the Less Paper, More Aid work that was initiated under ICFA back in 2015 and 16 to do some analysis of various aspects of partnership that could be simplified to reduce burden. That included looking at due diligence, looking at audit, looking at reporting aspects of partnership and how those could be simplified. I think a number of ongoing initiatives, Grand Bargain, for example, has a clear focus on efficiency, effectiveness, including reducing duplication and management costs under Workstream 4, and that's intended to support due diligence as well as one of the areas in which we could further reduce duplication, reduce some of the burdens of partnership as well. So wanted to highlight that this topic is an ongoing piece of work. We've had a number of initiatives over the years to focus on it, but important that we have, I guess, some further robust discussion on how we can work together and continue to crack this challenge of how to improve due diligence efforts. We do have some efforts in this area of harmonization and simplification that have seen some success. So I did want to highlight some of the work on reporting done through the Grand Bargain. Certainly we have some examples in the 8+3 template for those familiar with it in terms of how we can better harmonize reporting structures, at least on the narrative side, across humanitarian NGO partners, UN agencies, and donors to reduce some of the burdens associated with reporting. I would say, though, that in a way, although we've had some success on the reporting side, it's not necessarily logically where you'd want to start. And one thing that has been missing a little bit is a more comprehensive discussion around the project cycle and looking at some of the earlier steps in the project cycle and how to better harmonize and simplify there. So that would include due diligence, for example. If we look at a project cycle of how donors and their partners engage, certainly due diligence, partner selection happening at the start of the partnership cycle, moving into design, implementation, and reporting. So it really is quite important that we circle back and consider this question of due diligence, particularly as it starts off at the beginning of the relationship between donors and their partners. And I think is really an important opportunity is to set the stage from the start of a relationship when it comes to how we can be set up to harmonize, simplify, reduce burdens, and hopefully, as a result of that, improve our effectiveness in delivering humanitarian assistance. Right, I'm going to pause there. I don't want to take up too much time with the intro, but hopefully those are some helpful points to help us frame the discussion. With that, I want to start by introducing our panelists for the day. And I'll go ahead and introduce all three of our additional panelists and then call on them so they're, just so you have a heads up, I'll call on you to give some introductory statements and share some of your thoughts before we move to Q&A. So our three panelists for the day, first we have Mohammed Ahmad, who's currently serving as CEO of IDEA in Pakistan. That's the Initiative for Development and Empowerment Axis. And he's one of the founders and chair of the National Humanitarian Network in Pakistan, represents that organization in a number of humanitarian fora, which is quite impressive. The Charter for Change, Alliance for Empowering Partnership, A4EP, NEAR Network, and also the START Network. So I think engaged in a range of interesting networks that actually provide quite good input into both the localization issue and now due diligence as well. So welcome, Mohammed. We also have Vincent Henson joining us from START Network, and Vincent is the due diligence platform manager at START Network, leading this pilot work on tiered due diligence. So this topic for today is quite close to Vincent's area of interest and professional expertise. And he's worked in the charity sector for over 2 decades across various settings, including at the grassroots level, in the Philippines, all the way up to international institutions and global networks such as START. So welcome, Vincent. And we also will have Tanya Wood joining us today. Tanya is serving as the CEO of the CHS Alliance, the Core Humanitarian Standard Alliance. And she's led various international membership organizations, such as the International Federation of Anti-Leprosy Associations, ILEP. She was also Director of Partnerships and Policy at ICFA, the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, so a role I'm familiar with as well, and worked with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies as well. So welcome, Tanya. I think your range of background will be quite interesting to have feed into the discussion today, as well as the role of CHS in looking at this topic of due diligence. So with those introductions, I think we can get into our session. As I call on the first panelist to join us, I think just to highlight a couple of objectives for the session. Actually, we have 3 basic objectives to get into today, which hopefully you're familiar with from the introduction to the session, or the note for the session. So we're intending to hopefully generate some increased buy-in in the common vision towards a common standard that is passportable. We'll hear more about what that means in the discussion today across the sector, so how we can essentially harmonize due diligence efforts, hopefully simplify along the way. And 3 key objectives. So 1, we have a greater understanding of the challenges that current due diligence processes pose for actors, particularly national and local actors. Second, to share something of the learning journey that we're on, that different organizations have taken so far to help chip away at this objective of a harmonized approach to due diligence. So we'll hear something of the ongoing work, and hopefully have some discussion on a set of alternatives to simplify and make the process easier along the way, and an idea of what can be tested going forward, working towards a scalable solution in the humanitarian system. So some big objectives for our hour. Hopefully we can get into those. With that, I'm going to ask Mohammed Ahmad from IDEA to join us first. And Mohammed, to get us started, IDEA started as a community-led organization. So at the community level, now expanded to a national level approach in Pakistan. I wonder if you can share with us some of the challenges that you face as a national organization when it comes to due diligence, compliance structures you have to deal with in engaging with donors, and some of the burdens faced there. So over to you, Mohammed Ahmad, to start us off.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a long story how a local community organization get to this stage. We faced and we are facing a lot of challenges in this humanitarian setup. Somehow I can say when we started, so I remember in that very district, we were 2,000 community organization and only 3 survived. And this is the same is the case with the provincial level and then the national level. Shrinking of spaces, internal challenges and external challenges resulted in closing the offices of the civil society, especially of the local and the national one. During this journey, and still this is on, the subject of today is due diligence, so let me talk on that subject. Due diligence is basically a process whereby 2 partners assist each other if they have energy, capacity, and agency to implement a proposed project. And compliances, if they are operating according to the laid down policies or not. The dilemma is that in my lifetime, 20 years on now, I have never seen this 2 sides. It's always one side. Always the donor and international organization are doing due diligence of the implementing partner or the field partner. And this assessment is always one-sided. And there is a saying in our local language that, oh my beloved, I want to prove my love and I have proven it. But if you want me to do it every morning, every evening, so this will be a bit difficult for me. So because I have to do a lot of things. Every organization, when we survey, so we are conducting, we are being through this process at least 10 times a year, and our staff has been engaged in due diligence. Due diligence The lead partner is never going through this. If they are able to be in the partner, if they are able to be in a position to strengthen and support the implementing partner or not. And it is very easy to blacklist a local organization or a national organization on the plea that they are not complying, while the lead organization are getting a big chunk of fund for the strengthening, for the capacity building, for the oversight, monitoring, and compliance issue. But always the local organization uh, face the music. Due diligence, every donor and every lead partner has its own format of due diligence. And if we are going through 10 times every year, so this does mean that we are going 10 different type of due diligence every year. And for that matter, we need capacity in the organization. We need resources to retain those much capacitated staff to comply to all 10 organizations who have different formats, who have different procedures and policies. But the challenge we face that is a person capacitated in our organization and we invest in our colleague, the international organization, we cannot retain them because of the salary structure. And either an INGO or the international actor or UN, they hire them. And we start again. So we are playing the role of a primary school to graduate or to train staff for the international actor. And the second dilemma is if a finance officer of $300 salary, he is checked by a finance manager or finance officer who is getting $2,000, while only checking that finance officer. And even then, if there is any compliance issue, so the whole risk is shifted toward the local organization. This hamper the growth of the local and national organization. This is very time consuming and this is unjustifiable and injustice with the local and national organization. To be very frank, the need of the hour is it should be two-way. And there should be a standardized and harmonized due diligence process that if one organization can get to that, so at least for a year or two, that due diligence should be acceptable to all the international actors. So this is not on our part, this is on the part of the international actors or the donors agency to have a standardized and harmonized due diligence process for the local and national organization, even for the international as well. So if they can refresh this process every year or every second year so that we can save time because when emergency hit us, our first 2-3 months wasted in this process because we are not doing it before the crisis. We need to have freestanding partners and the due diligence must be done before and the due diligence must be customized. A due diligence is designed for our organization that has an age of 70 years while working in Europe, having a lot of resources. If you implement that that due diligence system on a local organization, having an age of 10 to 12 years or 15 years, while having no or less resources, and everything is in a very high-fi manner. You have a very costly financial system. We cannot afford it. You have like we have CHS for here, we have WICPA, we have the local organization cannot, sometimes we cannot even afford the fee because there is a lack of funding with us. The problem, the basic problem is we are being treated as contractor, not as partner. And the result of that is everybody is concerned with only their project time, and they are not bothering about what has happened before and what the organization will do after. So there is no funding allocation for the institutional development of the local organization that is negatively impacting our growth. So now the solution is multi-year humanitarian funding and capacity strengthening of both partners and due diligence of both partners, not of one partner only. And risk sharing mechanism, a risk management mechanism, not only to shift the risk to the local partner and blacklist them and the rest is okay. No, it's not this way. Sometimes we feel that our lead partner has less capacity than us. But as they are from the country where the donor is, where from the donor is, so they are preferring that organization to fund. So these are the complications we are facing. Now we are continuously advocating for on the platform of FOEP, EQUA, Start Network, Grand Bargain, that there should be a standardized and harmonized, a tiered due diligence process so that the organization can be judged according to their capacity, and that must be followed by a capacity strengthening plan. Secondly, there should be a multi-year humanitarian funding so that we can retain the capacitated staff after the emergency or the project over. There is upward accountability system is needed. There is a need of a critical review of the lead partner. If they are able to capacitate, if they are able to share the risk with the implementing partner or not. There is a need of duty of care as well because we are the front line and we are facing the risk. The casualties are a lot more than the rest. To 95%, from 95% to 98% casualties, and these are from the local organization because they are on the ground. But if you compare this figure with the resources allocation, so it's quite otherwise. The resources are going somewhere else where the risk lies somewhere else. So in this very environment we are operating in, yes, we are struggling. We have struggled and we will be struggling and we will be raising our voices in all these forums. There are some openings in the ground bargain, at least some guiding principle. If it is not binding, but at least something has come up. And there is a pilot from the Start Network for tier due diligence. So that is very encouraging. I think my time is over, so now the rest I can answer in the question and answer session. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. I think quite a, I guess, a range of challenges presented at the local level, and it's helpful to hear those highlighted quite clearly. I thought very helpful to hear about the point you raised on due diligence being one-sided and this question of how to make it more of a mutually beneficial process I think quite interesting to think about due diligence in that way, not only as a one-sided approach, but how can it be beneficial to all partners. And of course, the issue of partners as contractors versus true partnership, I think an ongoing question important to consider. And you raised as well the value of having a standardized process for due diligence accepted across the system. I think as we shift to our next panelists, hopefully that's a point we start to hear more about here, what some of the solutions might be to these very real challenges you raised when it comes to the burden for local partners in particular. I'd like to shift over to Vincent. And Vincent, as you come on, it would be great to hear more how you balance some of these donor demands, compliance issues, expectations with the need to enable better local access to funding, hopefully in a light that addresses some of these challenges that have been raised regarding the burden at the local level as well. So Vincent, turn it over to you to share some on the START network approach.
Right. Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks, Ahmad, for speaking about your truth. So I think maybe just to start with, I think it would be good for me to, to talk about the background and the context of why we embarked on this journey to redefine due diligence in the first place. So some of you may know about maybe 3, maybe 4 years ago now, START Network decided to decentralize and shift its network model into a network of networks. So composed of national and regional hubs in order to meet our commitments to the grand bargain and our wider ambition toward localization. So this meant that we would need to bring in more and more local and national organizations into the network and enable direct access to funding through our programs. So one of the major hurdles to this was our own due diligence framework, which you could say, was quite strict and inflexible and favored large INGOs that could afford to meet the level of compliance infrastructure that's required. So we knew that we had to change that approach. We also think that due diligence, as I think both Jeremy and Ahmad has mentioned, it's inefficient and duplicative. So when we asked our members, for example, on average, how many due diligence procedures do you go through in a year? The average was about 10 a year for the headquarters. And if you count the country offices, you're looking at hundreds. One member actually even told me that, their HQ goes through 44, in a year because they operate heavily in the Middle East, And our local members are also complaining that they have to go through one almost every month, and sometimes even for the same partner, just because it's a different program that they're accessing. So there's a lot of scope and room for improvement there. So what we decided to do was move away from the typical pass-fail model of due diligence, and we took this and developed a tiered due diligence framework that would place organizations in tiers, and members would then gain access to START's varying portfolio of programs and services depending on their tier. We partnered with TechSoup to help us develop this framework, since we really like their approach. The approach they took with similar service they provided in the US called NGO Source. So shout out to Caroline. I think she's on the call. Caroline, you could maybe post something on the chat in terms of NGO Source and TechSoup. Once we've developed the framework in 2019, and toward the end of the year, we started testing it through a membership intake pilot in our emerging hubs in the DRC, India, and Pakistan. So we brought in 12 local organizations through this process. So the outcome was that all 12 of them were successfully placed across the tiers, right? And based on the data we collected, that if we had used our previous inflexible framework, only 2 would have made it through. So the initial data was really promising in terms of the tiered model, enabling more local and national organizations to join the network. So once we've managed to bring in our initial set of local members, now what we had to test was how do we actually operationalize this across our programs. So last year, we started another pilot with the help of 3 of our donors, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Irish Aid, and Jersey Overseas Aid. So we set aside a small pot of money for our new members to access through the START Fund. And I think all of you would know, the pandemic hit, and it was even more crucial for us to get money directly into the hands of local organizations. So we instead set up another pot through 2 other private donors, specifically for responses to COVID-19. So this was initiated first, and you can read more about our key learning from this in the short 2-page report highlight, I think, that we'll be sharing in our chat. So Miriam will probably share that in the chat. There are also several case studies on our website about this, and a blog highlighting the experience of our members that went through the tiered due diligence process. So yeah, so in terms of our learning on this and the COVID-19 response, for example, so one of the key highlights for me there was how the overall satisfaction rating from the community supported in this response was actually at 99%. So and this was collected through a third-party independent monitoring service that our evidence and learning team commissioned. So I couldn't help but contrast that against the recent comments made by Mark Lowcock, lamenting how the humanitarian sector is not listening to the community. And so in some countries where OCHA operates, the satisfaction rating is 15%. So the first stage of the pilot was also really useful for us in terms of uncovering some of the challenges we faced with the design of our programs. For example, when we were reviewing our operational design, we hadn't realized how much of our training materials and guidance documents and resources were only available in English, and how our allocation committee meetings, these are fund decision-making meetings within the SART network, they are all conducted in English, and the time was always only convenient for Europe. So clearly we had a long way to go in order to adjust our programs to become more fit for purpose for our changing membership. All these learning are of course feeding into how we model our other programs. And so this year, we're also planning to operationalize this approach in our disaster risk financing program. So on the experience of our local members with undergoing the tiered due diligence framework, they mentioned that it helped them improve their policies and practices, and that they were able to leverage new partnerships because of it, which led to more funding, and that it also increased their confidence. So more on that in the blog, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we shared with you in the chat. But there's still also a lot of more work that we have to do. We have to get to a point wherein local organizations will feel that they don't need to move to a different tier, for example, because the level of access is already adequate across all the tiers that we have. So as a local organization, you shouldn't feel compelled to put in place the same compliance infrastructure as an INGO just to access more funding, for example. So I believe we're not there yet, but we're working on it. I guess in terms of next steps, so we also want to address the inefficiency and duplicative nature of due diligence, as I mentioned earlier, as Jeremy and Ahmad has mentioned earlier. So we want to address this through a global data repository where due diligence information and assessments can be shared and made more passportable, as we use the term. What we mean by that is that it will be taken into account and considered as valid by another agency, for example. So that's something that we want to be passportable between agencies. So for example, if all 50 of our SART network, 50 plus of our members within SART network were just to passport our due diligence in order to work bilaterally with each other, we would collectively not have to do 2,500 due diligence procedures. So now imagine what that could do if scaled up for the entire humanitarian sector. But for passporting to work, I think, for local and national organizations, we have to move away from the status quo, and because that's what's actually keeping local actors in the periphery, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning, for SART Network, this is a journey, and we are still continuously learning. We are exploring how we can redefine risk and accountability in light of discussions around the decolonization of aid, and there's still a lot to do in terms of how we shift power, including in the way we view compliance. If you look at it through the lens of power, I think as Ahmad was mentioning earlier, why is it that due diligence only flows in the same direction as the money, right? So, and whose risk are we measuring really? Is it ours? Is it our donors? And I'm sure Tanya will have further insights about this, but I believe we'd all agree that it's for the community, right? But is that really what's happening? I was at a bank de-risking session last Monday, and one of the local organizations from Yemen there in the panel commented that donors only want to share the successes, but never the risks. So but it's, you know, it's not all doom and gloom and more of the same, you know, on the donor side. Of course, we are seeing some positive movements on the donor side as well. And we're quite proud of our donors because they seem to be listening and stepping up to the challenge. They are supporting these pilots, you know, these initiatives that we have. The initial funding for the development of a tiered framework was actually from FCDO. And as I mentioned earlier, the funding for the pilots were coming from the Dutch Ministry and the Irish Aid and Jersey's Overseas Aid. So we do realize that it does take time to change, and different agencies will move at different speeds. And so I think the way we're balancing that is that I think we are here, we're providing the data, we're providing the evidence so that we can all move forward together with the donors. So just to address some of your things that you were raising earlier, Jeremy. I think there are still certain behaviors and ways of working we can change in order to promote more equitable partnership and even at due diligence stage. So for starters, we can share our own data, as Hamad was saying, with our, you know, so with our partners instead of having it as a one-way street. And so if you look at it that way, the global data repository is not just a means for due diligence to become more efficient and reduce duplication, but it also now becomes a tool to promote more equitable partnerships. So I believe we are only scratching the surface here, and there's a lot more that we can do to shift power to local actors and enable more equitable and fairer partnerships to flourish within the sector. So that's it from me.
Excellent, Vincent. Thank you for that. I think for some of us, introduction to the work going on by START Network in this tiered due diligence space. I can tell just from some of the questions coming up in the chat already that there's quite a bit of interest in this particular point on the tiered structure. So great for those of you that have pasted in the chat so far, continue to do that. I think we'll hopefully be able to circle back and hear some more on some of those responses to some of those questions. But I think excellent to hear your points, certainly highlighting the as with the mods, the sometimes extreme burden that can be placed on partners with multiple overlapping due diligence efforts. But also good to hear some of the successes so far in piloting and some of the broad interest beyond just the NGO side, but on the donor side as well in picking up a new model that might actually help us solve some of these issues going forward. So hopefully some more to come in the Q&A on that. With that, I would like to shift again and invite Tanya Wood from CHS Alliance to come in and share with us. And Tanya, as we shift into your points here, I think most people are familiar in some ways with the core humanitarian standards, certainly as they're known for the quality and accountability standard they offer for humanitarian actors. But it would be great to hear more from you how you see the link between core humanitarian standard, the due diligence efforts that we've heard some of today, and the role that CHS Alliance could play in the discussion. So Tanya, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone online. First, let me start off by saying just how pleased we are as CHS Alliance to join this conversation. It's always one that gathers quite a lot of interest, I think, at the HMPWs, and I'm really pleased that we're joining with the other networks, START Network and ICVA, to progress this discussion. And a real thank you to you, Ahmed, for kind of giving us such a good start of what the real, very real challenges are for the basis of this discussion. So for the core humanitarian standard, I just don't need to look at the names on this list to know this is known to you, but a reminder that it is a set of 9 commitments that the sector as a whole made to affected people. They were developed more than 6 years ago now with a far-ranging consultation involving national NGOs, INGOs, and importantly, the people themselves. And the driving idea behind, which still very much holds for the members of the Alliance, is that by having this set of the universal commitments, then if all organizations are adhering to them, living those commitments, then that better enables the people affected themselves can actually start to hold the organizations to account. So this is really an accountability tool. And when we're talking about due diligence, that's very much what we're positioning the discussion in. And I think for the CHS, which does try, by the name of it, the core humanitarian standard, it is meant to be across the board, again, not making any differentiation if you're a small local church group, a national NGO, an INGO, or a big UN body. You all have the same moral imperative to be able to live up to those standards. So that's obviously just a reminder of a reminder of the accountability mechanism that the standards play. But there's a secondary value that the CHS Alliance is definitely promoting along with our partner HCI. And we've been advocating hard, I hope, over the last few years of the potential for the CHS verification process, the process that we ask organizations to not only say they're adhering to the standards, but they're actually measuring themselves against it and, importantly, improving their processes against it. That this also, the CHS verification, has the potential to become a harmonizing effect for due diligence processes. I see on the line today we've got a number of the government donors, and some of them have already taken the bold step of asking for CHS verification to have a role in due diligence, the German government and the Danish government. And most recently, we were very pleased that ECHO have used the HCI audits, the HCI CHS audits, in their framework partner agreements. What this obviously means is that there is the potential and real results that we reduce the duplication, and obviously there's a money saving effect on that. But more than that, then it continues the virtuous circle of not only reducing the duplication, saving money, but reinforcing the importance of meeting the commitments that we've made and sort of doing what we said we would do. At last year's HMPW, together with HCI, we talked about the potential of the CHS being a harmonizing tool for due diligence processes, and we launched a review at that time. And the review shows that of most due diligence processes, the CHS audits can cover around 70 to 80% of most of these processes. So if that is the case, we feel that we're on a strong path, and particularly when we're able to work with our colleagues from the other networks like ICVA and START to be able to push this. Like, it's really, we've been talking about this for some time. Vincent, you highlighted the great work that START's been doing. Jeremy, we've been talking about the potential and lack of momentum in the grand bargain around the this means of addressing the harmonization of due diligence. So going back, I think we all need to kind of keep in mind, Ahmed, how you set this up for us, the very real challenge that is presented by these multiple due diligence processes. They take excessive time. It puts disproportionate amount of time and effort on the local operational organizations. And I think as Vincent highlighted so well, it just reaffirms a sort of glaring imbalance of power in the sector. It's going to take a bold move. As I say, we've been talking about it. We've got some donors who are stepping up. We've now got evidence that this can work. We've got the figures there to show that it can work, and we've got evidence of the sort of money saving aspect of it as well. So I really hope that the momentum, for all the reasons that you heard from Ahmed and Vincent before, now we can build on that momentum and start to actually make some changes that are so desperately needed in this. Thank you. Back to you, Jeremy.
Great, thanks Tanya for those comments from the perspective of CHS. I think in particular, your comment on looking at things like the core humanitarian standard, associated due diligence efforts in that lens of accountability to people and not just another means to feed the system as it is, quite an important view, I think, to keep in mind the ultimate purpose behind why we have systems like due diligence or standards in place, which should not just be to perpetuate the system as it is, but ultimately benefit the people that we're hopefully there to serve. So I think excellent to keep that view in mind as we go forward in the discussion in general. I think with that, we have some time to shift back and try and cover some questions. We've had a number of good points coming through in the chat already. Many, I think I might start off by turning back to Vincent as a start, because we have had a number of points come through. Interested to hear a little more detail on the tiered system that you introduced earlier. I think if we look through, there were some questions coming from Smriti around how high the bar is for NGOs. I think a few questions linked around that to the levels of tier due diligence and what the difference is between the levels, and if there's any link associated to, you touched on this a little bit, Vincent, the perceived value, or I guess level of risk with an organization at a particular tiered level. So perhaps I could turn it over to you, Vincent, to start us in the Q&A with a couple of more clarification points on the tiered system.
Right, sure. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for the comments on the chat from everyone. I think regarding the tiered model, the tiered system that we have, the way that we see it is that the tiered model is not that you are in a lower tier, therefore you're risky. That's something that we're trying to disprove and dispel with the evidence that we're gathering, with the with the organizations that we're bringing in and all the impact that they're doing, and the monitoring that we're doing. That is actually what we're trying to. That's a myth that we're trying to dispel. What the tiers dictate is actually that you have a different compliance profile, right? So this is what these are, different compliance profiles. And you, as a if you're an INGO, then maybe tier 3, for example, is the one that's more appropriate, because that's appropriate to the context that you operate in. You're a multi-million-dollar organization operating in 120 countries. That's not proportional to actually ask the same thing from a smaller organization, right? So the way that we see it is that actually this is looking at proportionality and looking at what is actually within the context of that organization. And when we look at risk as well, and even in how we're designing this as a risk-aware model, it's not the risk of the organization, but the risk of the entire operations of the program. So including us, including the community, and how that program is designed, in a sense that we have organizations right now that they're in different tiers that may be accessing 30,000 pounds from one program, but they're accessing 200,000 pounds in another program. Because that's the way that we're looking at it. We're looking at each as a different assessment of risk awareness, rather than just because you don't have X, Y, and Z, therefore you're riskier. That's not how we perceive this. So we have to start assessing, when we say risk awareness, we have to assess risk across that entire spectrum, across the entire program, rather than just looking at that particular organization, right? And basically looking at the context of that work. So I think, and also I think there are lots of questions about, I think, coming up in terms of what the criteria is. I think in general, just to say, when we have been mapping this, I think this because there are currently tier 1, 2, and 3, and we had the tier 4, but we're removing that because I think we thought it was overkill and we needed to simplify the process. But the idea is that we that, for example, likely an INGO would have a tier 3, for example, because it's lots of highly formalized processes and procedures, and policies that are in place. Whereas tier 2 would be more practical, elements that may also be addressing those risks. So doesn't mean that you need to have a particular policy to manage a particular risk. It just, what we're looking at instead are how can you manage the same types of risks without it being a policy, right? So a formalized policy. So those are things that we are looking at. So these are how we are nuancing some of the work that some of the tier model.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification, Vincent. And I think, as you mentioned, there are a number of points in the chat on this that keep coming in. So thank you for those. I'm sure Vincent can track those and follow up as well on anything that we don't cover today. I wanted to turn over Ahmad, maybe to come to you on a couple of points that I think might be of interest to have your perspective on. So one, there was a question raised again from Smriti around how high is the bar for local and national partners. I'm curious to you if you have any comment on the challenge in actually passing due diligence measures as they are. So you mentioned something on the burden of the frequency or the overlapping nature of the different due diligence requirements. Any comment from you on the difficulty in the current system in terms of passing due diligence in addition to frequency, one? And two, I might come back to the other panelists on this too. There was a point asking about links to the UN partner portal, which is an interesting potential link as well to comment on in terms of existing effort from the UN, not necessarily fully covering due diligence yet, but one approach to a common platform for sharing results of due diligence anyway. So curious, Ahmad, if you have any comment on use of UN partner portal from a national perspective as well. So over to you on those 2 points.
Thank you, Jeremy. The situation is that every donor or international actor, they prefer the big national organizations, so who they are confident enough that their systems are good enough. The problem is with the middle and the local organization. Even with the UN agencies, we are working, and our local and medium level, small and medium level organization are working. The donors are giving money to the UN and INGOs just to ensure the compliance of the local and small and medium organization. And this fees is quite high. What we are proposing and requesting for, that with quite low cost, you can strengthen the capacity of the local small and medium organization and can avoid the risk. That's why the humanitarian system is quite costly. We need localization. And for that matter, if, let me tell you, an INGO, an international actor, has local partner for 30 years, but they are not graduating them yet. And they are, so this is a chicken and egg. There is a political economy involved in it. If they will graduate them, so they don't see their role, then why then they will be getting funding from the donor? So we need to consider this aspect of political economy. So we are portraying the local small and medium organization very risky to the donor, so that they can fund the UN agency, they can fund the international actor to avoid that risk, which may be the case, which may not be the case. But this is the reality. In Pakistan, in country-based pool fund, we started with the UN, and the fund was allocated only 13% to the local organization, and the rest was going to the international actor. When we started lobbying for that, and even the UN agency was applying in that and competing with us, but when they started funding the local organization, it increased every year, and in the last 5 years, from 13%, we came to 83%. And this year, one allocation was come 100% to the local organization. And we faced no issue of compliance during this time. So sometimes this is reality, sometimes this is a myth. Yes, we need to take care of the creamy layer of the national organization as well. We need localization, and we need localization at national level as well. I do totally agree with Smriti on this. that we are avoiding risk. We need to take risk if we want to change the system. And donor must take this bold step because the current system is not workable. This is very much costly. It's very much time consuming. We need to invest in the risk taking as well. This is from my side. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for those points, Ahmad. I think that quite a profound point really there on the potential that the system actually perpetuates the view that local partners are inherently high risk, which may or may not, one, may or may not be true, and two, hopefully if we are operating effectively in the humanitarian system to meet the needs of people in crisis, we are in fact operating in high risk environments. If we're not taking risks, that's probably a bad sign that we're not in the right place to be meeting the needs of people who are suffering the greatest. So helpful to get your perspective on those points. I know we're coming close to the end of our very quick hour, but we want to keep going a little bit here. I'd like to turn over to Tanya again. There's a couple of questions come in the chat, Tanya, for you around the CHS compliance, particularly I think looking at the donor side and what remaining challenges there might be to really get donors to uptake consideration of CHS as a basis for a cross-cutting due diligence effort. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that around 70–80% of donor requirements can potentially be met through the CHS. So what are the remaining blocks to having donors take up an approach like CHS or a base like CHS for due diligence more broadly?
Thanks, Jeremy. Conscious of time, I'll just be quick. I think the other speakers outlined it. It's the risk value as well. It's us all having to give up our own amount of kind of control and control of the situation, and it's going to take political will. It's the numbers are there, the evidence is there, it's where is the political will for this. And while the government donors we're seeing are making some bold steps towards this, it's got to be throughout the whole chain of accountability. It's got to be for further up. There's a comment from Idcol from Coast of working with an INGO who, even when they could show they've been through the most rigorous of CHS verification, the CHS certification still wasn't accepted by another partner who may themselves have probably been through a similar CHS verification. So I think the time, it's really about, again, us as the networks coming together and seeing how we can promote this message. I think Pierre's been answering some of the questions around that. We do see that local NGOs can meet the CHS as well as some of the INGOs, if not better. So we can get to that kind of level of, again, the commitments that we've made to affected people being the basis of what we want to measure ourselves on. And then we've got to really sort of get that political will by the INGOs themselves, the pooled funds, and then the government donors being in line with that and willing to take some risks, maybe just to, so not to come across as sort of too naive or whatever. And I think it's been brought up by the comment from Elra is, you know, it may not, we'll never be able to satisfy all due diligence processes, but we should be able to learn as well from the work that's been done on the grand bargain on the 8+3 approach and take a sort of pragmatic step that we can cover the vast majority. And then we need to take an additional point to recognize the different due diligence processes of the different donors. So I hope we can continue this conversation and try and get that political will through to make that change and give up our own control.
Thank you, Tanya. Indeed, in our time today, we have enough to hopefully contribute to pushing forward the conversation, certainly not to resolve it. So hopefully this isn't seen as an endpoint in any way today, but a step in pushing forward, I think, this excellent conversation. I know we are at the top of our hour, but I wanted to give each of our panelists the opportunity to make a final concluding statement. So we can go through each of you, perhaps Vincent, if we turn to you first, would you like to share any final thoughts based on the conversation today and what's been quite a robust conversation back and forth in the chat as well. So thanks for those contributing there too. So Vincent, over to you for a final thought.
Right. Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks everyone as well for your comments. There's a lot and we will try to get through them and send you our responses in in another format, I guess. I think for us, the main keywords are equitable and proportional. So we want to see a fair system wherein compliance and due diligence, are viewed through the size and operations and context of an organization. So we shouldn't expect a local organization operating in one province in the Philippines with an annual turnover for like $50,000, for example, to have the same compliance infrastructure as a multi-million-dollar INGO, right, operating in 90 countries. So why are we cascading requirements and turning them into clones of ourselves in a sense? So, and these points are not new. I've been discussing, risk sharing about this, in the sector for quite some time now. And so for Start Network, we will continue to have these difficult conversations, and we'll continue to explore how we can practically move forward. And we see that this tiered due diligence framework and the creation of a global data repository on due diligence and promotion of sector-wide passporting, as concrete steps that we can take to test, new ways of working that are fairer, for local and national organizations. And when I say fairer, something that's moving away from the status quo, because if we're just going to use the same metric, that this is like, everybody is like, all of the current institutional donors are happy with this particular model, or like, then it's the same model that's actually keeping local and national organizations from accessing funding in the first place, right? So I think we need to move away from that status quo. So we see that that this we can take these new steps and new ways of working, and then help shift the power in the sector. So if you're interested to know more, or maybe you want to work with us, you want to take this journey with us, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I will leave my email in the chat.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you for your efforts as well to push this important topic forward. Tanya, over to you for a final thought.
I think the time's right. We had the ERC last week saying we're not doing enough for affected people. We've got this sort of everyone agreeing that due diligence processes are too much. Maybe the time is right to take some bold measures where we really base our due diligence processes on the commitments the sector's made to affected people. And I think the time's right to push that.
Excellent. Thanks, Tanya. I'm hopeful as well that the time is right to push on this topic. And Ahmad, over to you to share a final thought with us.
Thank you, Jen. The local must be involved, because if we are framing policies, determine standard and design procedure and plan for them, so they must be involved. They may have solution for the problem. The donors are the international actors are worried about. Secondly, as a network, I'll request ICWA, START, and CHS, FOREP, NEAR to have a robust advocacy for the standardized due diligence and harmonized reporting system, and multi-year humanitarian funding now. This is the right time, and this is need of the hour. All these networks are representative of the international and local civil societies, and we are expecting from you that if you can convince the donors, because they are the decision makers, and if we can convince them that there is a less risk involved in trying the new ways of working, what the risk we are facing in the current system. So, but a bold step is needed. Who will take it? I think this is your responsibility, EQUA, START Network, C4C, CHS, to convince and to have a dialogue on these subjects with the donors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. I think that's an appropriate sentiment to end our conversation on today. Certainly, I can say for myself representing one of those networks, ICFA, we can take up the challenge that you present in front of us to try and represent both that perspective of the local and national actor that we've heard quite strongly today, and take up the challenge to take advantage of the current opportunity that it seems that we have in the system to push forward on this. And I would hope the appetite to do so. As I mentioned at the beginning, these are not new topics, but we do seem to have an important window of opportunity right now to push forward. So I appreciate you laying out that challenge for us, Ahmad, and something that hopefully you can keep us accountable to as well as we move forward and push us on as we try and fulfill that challenge and hopefully address this issue of due diligence as well. Friends, we're past the top of our time. I knew it would go quick today, but I want to thank each of our panelists for some excellent introductions for some of us to the work on due diligence. For others, I think a good insight into where we're headed. And hopefully, as Ahmad said, this is not just a one-off discussion, but a piece of the taking up the challenge that's in front of us to push forward on this topic of due diligence, and in particular, the harmonization and simplification of those systems that can really be beneficial, not just in the interest of being more efficient, but actually better meeting the needs of people that we're there to serve. So appreciate all of you for joining on the panel and for the robust discussion in the chat. I think we did have at least one comment on the chat around follow-up on the questions, and that's something I mentioned at the beginning that we'll take up offline and hopefully be able to answer a number of the questions we didn't cover in the conversation and respond to those and share out over email afterwards. So thank you again for everybody joining as a participant or a panelist, and I hope the remainder of your sessions for HNPW go well, and the rest of your day and work week too. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Thanks everyone.
Yep, thanks all.
Thank you.